Okay, good morning, everyone. Very, very warm welcome, said it backwards, to our dialogue on African wild plants. We have a great crowd here in person, and we also have a great crowd online. I say that with a bit of nervousness, and greetings, folks online. It's the first time we've tried to do a mixed live and online conference. I think it'll work. I know it'll work, but I also know we'll learn how to do it better next time. So bear with us as we work through our first in-person and online event. So before going further, what I thought I would do is to ask Professor Danie Brink, who's the Dean of the Faculty of AgriSciences, to say a few words to welcome everyone. And then I will take on from there and work us through our program. Danie, over to you.
Thank you for the invitation and also the opportunity to welcome you. I've come a long way with AWEI. They've traveled a long road, most of it uphill, but that breeds character. And it was really heartening to see last year when they got deserved support from the Oppenheimer's Generation Conservation and Research Program. And we, the university, would also like to acknowledge their contribution, making these dialogues, possible. Waking up this morning in the world geopolitical space, and we were sharing a joke at the table about an optimist and a pessimist and a realist. It can't make you anything else than think about the world. But you don't have to grasp on the complexity of Europe and Ukraine. I think we have our own complexities right at our doorstep in South Africa to deal with. I think one of our biggest challenges is how do you make people that don't benefit from society believe in the future so that they prepare to invest in that. And you often get parents who make sacrifices for their children, but we need to make that a value system in our modern society going forward. And it's easy for us to sit here in the luxury of the Lanzerac and in elect, conversation. But I think our biggest challenge out there is to make people believe in the future. We've received a generation of young, naive, enthusiastic students on the main campus. And although it's superficial, if you travel Dorp Street and you see them all in the pubs and last night at the Varsity Cup. But you won't believe the extent of confusion amongst these kids and how visible it is after 2 years, knowing our reference point, what we were receiving and what we're receiving now. There's huge confusion amongst a new generation of thought leaders that is going through higher education and the opportunities that society do offer them. But closer to this topic, I grew up in the Namaqualand and I come to appreciate, nature and the ecosystem, and also the plant life, because that's probably the biggest asset that Namaqualand, has. It's not an easy place to cut out a living. And you also come to appreciate the interdependability, of one person on another, whether it's a lift to Cape Town or medical assistance, but you also come to understand, the interdependency of nature through its cycles of drought and prosperity and the beautiful flower seasons. And nowadays, with the onset of ecotourism in that area, it was so beautiful a couple of months ago when I visited the town of Kamiskroon. And if you visited Kamiskroon 10 years ago, it was really going down like all these small rural towns. And all of a sudden, Kamiskroon was picking itself up maybe on its own bootstraps, and it was the cycling ecotourism, fraternity that brought the town, to life. First of all, only in the flower season, which was that short, and nowadays also in the winter season, because to enjoy the beautiful Kamiesberg Mountains and to enjoy Namaqualand's biodiversity even without any flower, around. But yeah, so I think the important thing of this dialogue and what is important in the world is a process of thought leadership coming up with leadership concepts, ideas taking it right through to implementation that gives substance to people's belief. I think there's a lot of people that are willing, but they're not equipped to lead for some reason or another. But they're really very willing, and it's to convince them to buy into these long-term societal concepts. And I think this is a great example where there's a responsibility on us that has been privileged to be trained up, to become professionals and educated, to share that back with people that sometimes got they drew the short stick in life. And I think this is a great opportunity through leadership, conceptualization, and ideas to take something back to those societies and to assist and partner with them on implementation. To really convert this idea of a wildlife economy into a real beneficiation to people, because I think those people, the poor people of Africa, the disadvantaged people of Africa, is probably our most important agents for conservation. If we can't convince them to buy in, whether it's not to cut bark of municipal fever trees in Kuilsrivier, nowadays even inside Stellenbosch, if you can't convince them, of the opposite, to go into the opposite direction, I think, we're turning a blind eye to the real challenges of society and the world. And I think it's a brave decision to you and your team. It's a worthy concept, and it's going to need everyone's contribution to make it work. So thank you very much for laying it on, seeing the process through. And I look forward to participate in the dialogue for the rest of the morning. Bye, Danie.
Thank you, Professor Brink. Very encouraging words. So my name is Frank Vorhies. I didn't introduce myself. I'm the director of the Institute. And as you can hear by my accent, I'm not from Africa. I'm from Chicago. I'm a wannabe African, but nobody will give me a passport. So I still live with my American passport. There we go. We've got 4 presentations, and we're going to try and have the presentations and discussion all wrapped up by 12:30. So what each of the presenters is going to try and stick to about 15 minutes. Touch wood, we've all got days that we can talk, but we'll do about 15 minutes each. After each presentation, we'll have a couple minutes for questions of clarification so that we can try and have some good time at the end for some discussion. And what we'll do a little bit at the questions of clarification, but also at the end, is try and have both questions and comments coming from our in-person group here in the room, and also from our participants online. And so we are monitoring the chat box online, and we'll bring in feedback from that as well. The event's being recorded, so you'll have an opportunity to go back and see parts of it, or fast forward through parts of the good parts and so on at a later stage. And also the PowerPoint presentations will be available later on as well. Okay, so let's start with let me see if I can get this to move. I haven't tried it yet. Aha. So the first presentation is by Gus Le Breton, who's our keynote speaker, who's come down from Hawaii to see us. And I love his product line. He's the African plant hunter. So we don't just hunt mammals, we hunt plants on this continent. And he's going to talk about the opportunities that exist in plants. Now, Gus has got about a 4-hour presentation, but he's going to give you 15 minutes of it. And I said to him, if you guys want more, you have to fly up to Hawaii and have a chat with him later on. Gus, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to start with a short video clip. This was taken in the UK about 3 years ago. I think it's fairly self-explanatory.
I don't know.
The bay about, no.
I have never seen that. It looks like a furry sweet potato.
It feels hollow. Is it real? It feels like hairy.
Oh, are we supposed to eat that, like an apple?
It looks like a bit of a naked coconut.
Oh, I see. We can do sounds with that.
Ah, it's like, maybe it's like a musical instrument. Are you sure it's a fruit?
I'm going to guess that's from South America.
Africa?
Oh, right. I have heard of that. I had no idea that's what they look like. That's the big fat trees, right?
Maybe there must be, because there must be some sort of trick.
Like a coconut, just maybe smash it.
Oh,
we got a little crack. Yeah, it's not my first time at the baobab, clearly.
Is this really a fruit?
I mean, from a look, it looks like it's some kind of popcorn inside a fuzzy, naked coconut.
It looks weird. It's like powdery.
Mmm. That's nice. Bit like a strawberry or berry, like a red berry. It's really nice, but sort of powdery as well.
The meaning behind that will become clear. So yeah, I'm standing here speaking to you because I've been working with indigenous plants in Southern Africa for quite a long time. A few of the organizations I've been involved with are up there. Fighter Trade Africa, the trade association that first promoted trade in natural products from Southern Africa, the African Baobab Alliance, which I'm going to talk to you about. I've got my own business exporting Kaiser Natural Oils. That's another business, also mine, and a few others. So my personal lifetime mission has been to develop Africa's economic botany sector and enable it to become a leading driver of biodiversity conservation, sustainable land management, and economic empowerment. I guess most of us have broadly similar objectives. I'm going to start by just to kind of put this into context by sharing with you the impact goals of the African Baobab Alliance, which is an association across Africa with companies from other parts of the world that promotes trade in baobab products. So, by the way, I use the pronunciation baobab rather than baobab, which may surprise you, but most people in Africa call it baobab, and I've just come to call it that too. So our first goal as an alliance is that 1 million rural African women will be benefiting from it, from the sale of the fruit every year. That's not currently the case, but currently we're on probably tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000. But 1 million is perfectly achievable. Second one is that 10 million hectares of baobab woodland are effectively conserved and managed. 300 million tons of carbon are sequestered every year. Sorry, I couldn't get a picture of carbon being sequestered, so I got a nice flower instead. And finally, that the industry is worth over $1 billion a year to Africa. That's a company in Utrecht, called Eco Products, which some of you may have heard of, Dr. Sarah Fenter. So, plants and wildlife. Well, the traditional definition of wildlife technically obviously excludes plants. It's more kind of four-legged. But since plants are the habitat and the food for wildlife, they're obviously fairly important to the whole wildlife economy. And on a broader level, plants provide a range of economic opportunities to smallholders in Africa. And the role of wild harvested plants in the rural economy has historically been overlooked and undervalued. And the reason is that most of those uses are non-commercial. So we're talking about fuel, food, shelter, medicine, shade, ecosystem services. But a fairly obvious point is that if these were not available to rural people in Africa and they actually had to buy them, it would be costing our economy billions and billions of dollars every year. So now let's look at the commercial use, the formal sector. So plant products have been traded in Africa for as long as they've been traded anywhere in the world. But most of it is in the informal economy, and it therefore isn't really recognized and appreciated. But now there are a range of formal commercial opportunities around indigenous plants that perhaps did not exist a few hundred years ago. And the trends that are driving that is particularly around healthier eating or healthier drinking, herbal medicine, natural, all that kind of thing. That's creating these new opportunities. Also at a policy level. So here in South Africa, the bottom left, that's your national bioeconomy strategy, of which biotrade, which is the term that's used for trade in plant-derived products, is a big component. We're also developing one in Zimbabwe, which I'm involved in. And this is a Swiss-funded project, Swiss-German funded project in Southern Africa, developing the biotrade sector. There's a lot of things going on at the moment. And from the industry perspective, Africa is definitely seen as the new frontier for natural ingredient research. Natural ingredients is the term that's used commercially for kind of plant products going into industrial applications. So this is a European and EU website that's got a whole story on African ingredients. These are a couple of companies that specialize in African ingredients. The top company is a British company called Aduna, and they sell only African ingredients. This is an American company at the bottom that sells only African ingredients, and there are many, many, many others. There's also been this natural ingredients South Africa project run by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs for quite some years already, perhaps one or two beneficiaries of that program in the room now. So why is everyone getting so excited about Africa internationally, although we may not know it? Well, obviously, Homo sapiens evolved from Africa, so it stands to reason that we've been using plants in Africa probably longer than anywhere else in the world. But even though it originates, human use of plants originates in Africa, just as humans originate in Africa, we represent a very, very tiny proportion of the global market for natural ingredients. And it's not because we don't have them, and it's not because we haven't used them. We've got as much biodiversity as everyone else. We've got as much traditional knowledge as everyone else. But it's because we've never recognized, acknowledged, and invested in the sector. And it's a huge opportunity. I mean, that's actually an amazing thing, because in other parts of the world, they're already far more developed, and there's much more that has been done. In Africa, we're starting at the beginning, which means for relatively little effort, you can actually achieve quite a lot. And of course, this does tap into a major global market trend towards natural and healthy. Other advantages of developing our natural ingredient sector in Africa: it creates comparative advantage for African producers. Obviously, we can never produce soybeans as well as Brazilians produce soybeans, or any of the other commodities that we focus on in Africa. But when it's an African ingredient, we can definitely produce it better than they can in other parts of the world. Most of Africa is dry. Some of it is very dry. You know that very well in South Africa. And of course, the conventional arable agricultural production is very precarious in those environments. And yet we've got this entire continent covered in plant biodiversity. These are plants that have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years and are perfectly suited to be exactly where they are exactly now. And then we replace them, we remove them, and we replace them when we plant something that comes from a different part of the world, and we stand and scratch our head and wonder why it's not doing so well. So it's kind of an obvious point. Of course, it is much more consistent with sustainable biodiversity conservation to be using indigenous plants as the basis for a production system than to be removing them and cultivating crops from other parts of the world. It also helps alleviate human-wildlife conflict. Anyone that's ever seen elephants plowing into a mealie field will know that the inherent paradox in removing native vegetation, planting something that elephants love, and then wondering what's gone wrong here when the elephants come and eat it all. It is, of course, also as an industry particularly favorable to women, since generally most things involving harvesting of wild products in Africa are viewed as women's priority or prerogative. It is a much more climate-proof rural production system than arable agriculture, because it is so much better adapted to the environment. It's also, to use this diagram that I'm sure many of you have seen before, inherently regenerative rather than extractive. I'm not going to go into that in detail. And it has very strong potential links to the tourism industry, which is, of course, a major growth sector for Africa. So this here is argan oil production in Morocco. Any of you ever been to Morocco will know that going to visit a women's producer cooperative of argan oil is an integral part of the tourism experience in Morocco. And there are many other places around the world where natural product processing is part of the tourism product, a lot less so in our part of the world. And finally, in terms of benefits, there's the health benefit. We are struggling in Africa from the over-reliance on a very narrow range of food products, particularly in Southern Africa on maize. And it's not healthy, it's not good for us. And we've got this hidden hunger where people have got volumetrically plenty of food, but just not the right nutrients. And of course, a more diversified diet would certainly lead to a healthier population. So there's the question, why aren't indigenous plants already a central part of the production system? If it's so obvious, there's so many benefits that I've just outlined, why isn't it happening already? It's a question I've spent 30 years asking myself. And I think I've finally figured it out. Okay, firstly, it's obviously because of policy blindness. And the main issue there is that we've had 100 or more years of agricultural policy that have promoted kind of industrial agriculture based on a very limited number of cash crops, almost all of which originate from outside of Africa. In many parts of Africa, we also had colonial era legislation that systematically ignored the opportunities from indigenous plants. In Zimbabwe, we have a law that still exists to this day called the Suppression of Witchcraft Act, which outlaws making potions from indigenous plants. So muti is actually illegal in Zimbabwe. So policy blindness is 50% of the problem, and the other 50% is the lack of a ready market. So this, again, I'm taking an example from Zimbabwe just to show you, but I'm sure it's the same all over Africa. We have a grain marketing board, which is owned by the government, that buys all the maize that is produced by any farmer. And at the beginning of the season, it's a very simple relationship. You know, when you plant maize, at the end, you're going to sell it to the government for a certain price. It's easy. You don't have to think about it. It's a no-brainer. It's the same with tobacco. It's the same with cotton. It's the same with all the major commodities. And we just simply do not have that kind of infrastructure for natural ingredients. But the good news is both of these can easily be changed if you put your mind to it. And this, which is admittedly actually a photograph of an empty supermarket shelf in Zimbabwe, but it's illustrating the point that 10 years ago, there were no baobab products on the market. And these are the products that you see today. This is a very small cross-section, but all of you, I'm sure, have heard of baobab somehow, somewhere in the kind of health, food, and beverage sector, and it's everywhere around the world. And that is a result of the work that has been done to systematically promote this sector. Now, if I had another 3.5 hours, what I would do is I would go through and I would tell you exactly what we did to develop this sector. I'm not going to do that, but it is in my presentation. So you will be able to get the presentation and to have a look at it, because I think the point is we absolutely set out from day one to develop this sector for the benefit of African producers and for the benefit of biodiversity in Africa. And it's still work in progress, but we've achieved a hell of a lot in a relatively short space of time and with quite limited resources. So that's the first meeting of the African Baobab Alliance in 2018. You might recognize Sarah there. This is all work that's been done to try to grow this industry. Those are some videos on my website about monitoring, which have been quite popular, ecological monitoring of baobab harvesting. Okay, and then my conclusion is just from the baobab sector and extrapolating broader into plants in the wildlife economy. So the first lesson is that you need to go about this systematically. It doesn't just happen by itself. And we have found that sector support organizations are really, really effective. Sector support organization is a grouping of producers, researchers, players, academics in the sector that work together to try to promote it. And that's just showing you from 2010 up to 2018. I don't have more recent figures, the growth of the baobab market and the volumes that have gone. A few hiccups, but it's been quite clear upward progression. The critical role in sector support is eliminating the barriers to adoption. So trying to make it easier for people in the whatever industry it is, it's the food industry or the herbal medicine industry or the beverage industry, to start to use these natural ingredients. Regulatory hurdles, lack of scientific research, lack of awareness, poor quality, unreliable supply, etc. The third lesson is we really do need efficient and rational supply chain configurations. When you think about how much money has been invested in developing the maize supply chain in Africa, and I'm talking tens of billions of US dollars over the last 100 years. Imagine if we'd had even 10% of that and put that into some of these plant products, how big they would be. Fourthly, there is a huge untapped market opportunity within Africa. And we have tended to focus with baobab on the export market. And the reason was that 10 or 20 years ago, African consumers were not interested in African ingredients. They felt that there was a stigma associated with them and that they felt that that was something that they had consumed as a child and they didn't want to consume as an adult. And that's changed, which is amazing, and it creates huge opportunities. Finally, the final conclusion there is about ABS regulations and the opportunities that we have to use them to our advantage. Those of you who find this whole area frightening, and I'm one of them, but it's also potentially beneficial. So this is what I say. Plants have a huge potential role in the wildlife economy. It's taken us nearly 20 years to get baobab to where it is now. We've learned a lot along the way. We should be able to reduce the lead times the next time round because of the lessons that we've learned. And I would say that the sooner we start on this process, the quicker we're going to get to the end. So that is my flying whip through plants in the wildlife economy. I don't think I've ever given a presentation so quickly, but Frank was sitting there pointing at his watch like that going. So if you want to find more about me, you can look at my website, African Plant Hunter. And yeah, thank you.
I thought you did that very well. People like you and I should learn to talk less, not more. I think we're more effective. That was excellent. It was a very good presentation. Two quick take homes for me was sector support organizations. We have a spectacular faculty of AgriSciences at this university that has very much been part of supporting what you were saying, the industrialized side. Can we get more of our universities supporting also the wild side of food and of cosmetics and so on, and let alone the trade organizations? And the second take home, which I think is really important for wildlife economy in Africa, is the market on the continent. So it's not just exporting to these guys looking at naked coconuts in the UK, but it's selling the stuff around the continent. And so this African Continental Free Trade Agreement that we have may be a huge opportunity for us to open this market up and get these products sold continent-wide, 50 countries in the continent. But to do that, people, consumers, regulators need to be assured that these products are well made, that people are paid well, that they do respect biodiversity, all the things that Gus has talked about. So our second speaker will be talking about that. But before I go to that, just any one question of clarification. I thought that was very clear. But if anybody had something they want. ABS is access and benefit sharing, if somebody doesn't know that lingo. And that has to do with the third objective of the Convention on Biological Diversity and then the Nagoya Protocol. And like Gus, boy, it's a big area and you know about it. Our third speaker, it's the world he's in. So, okay, good. So there, you were clear as well. Okay, so now what we'll move on to is our next speaker, which is Deborah Vorhies, is the new CEO of the FairWild Foundation, which is based in Switzerland with staff in the UK. But more importantly for us, she's also our Chief Operating Officer here at the African Wildlife Economy Institute. So she's going to knock heads here and up in Europe on this topic. So she's going to talk about what FairWild does to promote wild plants.
Thank you, Frank. As Frank said, well, most of you know me from AWEI context, but actually I have a day job, and that day job is to work with the FairWild Foundation to try and do exactly what Frank said, is to see how we can actually make sure we can grow the business of wild plants, making sure that it delivers on conservation, inclusive economic, and social benefits as part of an integrative wildlife economy. So FairWild Foundation, we exist to develop and implement standards on a private sector basis for fair and sustainable wild collection. We're a non-profit organization founded in Switzerland, but working closely with traffic in the UK as well. I'm just trying to see where to go next. So that's us. I'm just trying to make sure I connect both. So most of my presentation, because this is a very new job for me, I only joined this month, I should say, or rather 1st of February. And I'm not a plant expert. I come from a background in policy, law, economics, and business in the wildlife economy and sustainability sector. So I am not an expert, but Gus is on my board. There are numerous other experts here. If you have technical questions, I'm going to back you to them. I'm focusing on how do we make this a reality in a business sense that delivers on those things. And surprisingly, wild plants is an enormous resource globally. 60,000 species are used globally for medicinal purposes. And I can tell you that there must be in Africa, some data I was looking at, several thousand. So this is a real opportunity in Africa. 26,000 of the 60,000 have well-documented medicinal and aromatic uses. And again, as Gus pointed out, a lot of these in Africa, this is indigenous. This is part of our culture. This is the way it's always been here. And increasingly nowadays, people around the globe are starting to realize this and starting to demand these products. So if we can go forth to make this a sustainable and fair reality, it could make an enormous difference to the economy of Africa. 3,000 species are traded internationally at present. There is potential for this to grow. And interestingly, a majority of them are sourced through wild harvest. So if we look at medicinal plants globally, the question is firstly, how do we know that we are supporting conservation? Only 19% are assessed against extinction threat criteria. So in other words, we know that we're not harvesting them. So for 81% of these species, we just don't know. And of the 19% that are assessed, we know so far that about 10% are threatened with extinction in the wild. So in other words, this is telling us that we need to pay attention to the conservation status. We really need to find out how harvesting these plants can support conservation, as well as our other objectives, the climate resilience, the inclusive economics, and the social well-being. We also know, as from what Gus said, I'm just taking a little global look here, at the rate of increase in international trade in medicinal and aromatic plants. It's huge, it's growing, the markets are growing. All the more reason why we need to somehow have a way to provide assurance that this is being done in a way that secures those conservation, social and economic outcomes. So we know some features of the wild plant trade, that there are millions of wild harvesters, individuals involved in the business, often in very low income communities, and often really at the bottom of the totem pole economically. We know that many people rely on wild plants for their health and their income. They are the collectors. Much of the trade we know is informal and underreported or not at all reported. We also know that what regulations there are often overly complex and inaccessible to the kinds of people who are working in these industries. And we know also that there is a serious threat to traditional knowledge and practice, which traditionally supported conservation. So there are some challenges there, but there are also lots of opportunities, as Gus pointed out. We know that around the globe, people are increasingly aware of the need for sustainability and fair trade objectives, so that there is a reason people they want these products and they want to see, they want it clearly demonstrated to them that these products deliver these outcomes, these conservation, economic and social outcomes. They also want to be sure that the process that ensures those outcomes is believable, is credible, and that it is real. It's not just somebody saying so. So we know that there is that demand, that growing demand from the market. We know that there is a market interest in knowing where things come from, tracing their origin. We know that best practice is emerging and therefore can be utilized, understood, and shared. We know that there's an attempt to improve policy and legislative. Policy blindness is indeed a big thing. I get it. But there's an interest in moving forward. There's an interest in biodiversity economy in this country and throughout Africa. And we also know the final point is so important, is that we are increasingly around the globe seeing landscape level. This is the vision of AWEI, just to go back to AWEI for a moment, to see that landscapes can be conserved, managed, evolved, restored in such a way that they deliver conservation outcomes, inclusive economic opportunities, and social well-being, as well as climate resilience. The only way we can do that is by taking a holistic view at a landscape. It's not just animals, it's not just bugs, Mopani worms, from my friend at the back there, it's plants. We need to be taking the overall look, and we need to be taking the overall sustainable economic development look. So what is FairWild? Okay, so this is quite technical. We're a sustainability standard. So in other words, we develop the standards that help people harvest these things, process these things, deal fairly with the people that do the collecting, process, make the goods, market the goods, and sell them. We do this through third-party audited certification for wild harvested plant ingredients. Third-party, objective, clear standards out there. Secondly, we combine fair trade principles. Are people treated fairly? Are people treated appropriately? Are we respecting ABS? With ecological sustainability, and increasingly how this fits into the whole landscape. It is a universal instrument, globally applicable in different kinds of scenarios, which means that consumers can take a look and understand wherever they buy the goods. We have a lovely little logo. So our mission is to enable the transformation of resource management and business practices to be ecologically, socially, and economically sustainable throughout the supply chain, from the person that picks the plant to the person that drinks the pack of tea or whatever they do. We have a series of institutions we work very closely with, such as the IUCN Medicinal Plant Specialist Group, so we can really guarantee and underpin the conservation status of what we do, WWF, Profound, Traffic, and the Wildlife Friendly Environment Network. So we're encouraging fair and sustainable business practices, influencing consumer choice, working with customers who have projects in these areas and the implementation of our standard, and providing advice on the application of standards. We're a nonprofit. We're not in here to make profit and make a lot of money, but we are here to ensure that everybody in the value chain gets the support and guidance they need. This is a nice complex little thing which just shows how FairWild engages with the certification bodies, supervising, ensuring the data, getting things standardized, the auditing and collection process, the producers, and down to the brand and micro enterprises. It's just a little graphic. I'll keep moving fast because Frank has already got his beady eye on me. And our sets of principles deal with conservation. Here we say wild plant resources and environmental impacts. We are revising and upgrading our standards at the moment. We're about to embark on a major revision, and that will certainly help us look more broadly at landscape engagement. Social and fair trade requirements, how people are employed, what benefits there are for collectors, legal and ethical requirements, management and traceability in business practice, which is essential, and ultimately promoting FairWild buyer commitment for the people that buy these certified products. Here's an example. Now, this is a non-African example, and it's really just out there to show you how trade value chains in any product these days, including in these plants, is a global thing. So here, for example, we have dandelion root collected in Poland, somewhat processed in Germany, finally put together in France, then it goes to the States, and then it gets sold globally. It just shows you how the world is so connected these days that you have to have this sort of chain of custody throughout the value chain of a product. And that's what we try to do at FairWild. I should just issue a disclaimer. We are not the only people trying to do this. There are other organizations. We just happen to think we do it very well because of our focus on conservation and fair trade. But there are others out there. I'm happy to talk about that. Risk analysis is a key feature for us. Is what is the risk to that particular species? Is there, a risk of extinction? And we look at trade data, we look at biological data, and this gets carried out by the IUCN Medical Plant Specialist Group members. So that's, I think, one of our key USPs. Other main features are we look based on the compliance of wild collection operations with performance indicators, on-site audits by third-party bodies. We have a continuous improvement approach. We have sort of look at how scores increase over 5 years, and we distinguish between low, medium, and high risk. That's just a bit of technical stuff. Similarly, I don't want to dwell too much on technical aspects here, but I do want you to get a feel for how comprehensive and detailed and focused our activities are, and they need to be in order to get these outcomes. We are undertaking a review of our standards. We're benchmarking against other standards. They do exist. We do training, capacity building, and we do online auditor training as well. This is how our accreditation is open. I won't dwell on that. Similarly, the traders we work with are registered, and this is all available on our website. Please go there because the standards are there in full, and you can see exactly how we work. And also this will be on the AWEI website. And this is the kind of labels we have. So brands used our little logo there. And that really says something then to the consumer. The consumer can feel assured through all those things I mentioned about the ecological status. Increasingly, we will be looking at landscape, the economic outcomes, and the social outcomes. So what is FairWild doing right now? We've got 25 species are certified from 14 countries, 1,200 tons, 60 different products, because of course one species can make more than one product, more than 40 companies on board, over 70 countries. Loads and loads of ingredients. Now, most of these are not particularly African. Baobab obviously is, bear's garlic you can get in Africa. Also from the northern east part, there's myrrh and frankincense. I think licorice root is all about, but I started doing some research in my new job because I was thinking about, I'm very Africa focused in my life and worldview. I can't help it, right? And I started just understanding and discovering the enormous potential of African products. And every time I do a bit more research, I find more products that we could be talking about and thinking about. Cape aloe, which in fact is being heavily harvested, increasingly used, and I believe is now even having to be listed with CITES on Appendix 2. Rooibos, of course, who in the world doesn't know about rooibos? Buchu, which solves everything according to my mother. Doesn't matter what's wrong with you, Buchu will solve it, okay? Devil's claw, marula, something called num num. I hadn't heard of num num before, but amazing honeybush, and of course, pelargoniums, which are also seeing a dramatic increase in uses. So these products are there, they're being harvested. Maybe they need big global markets, well served by sustainable harvesting and fair trade. And of course, we have the product Baobab from Zimbabwe. I won't say anything more about it because Gus has done his thing. And the frankincense and myrrh, more largely from Somaliland and the Arabian Peninsula, those areas. So in the international context, what does FairWild do? We're here to support the delivery of the Convention on Biological Diversity's global strategy on plant conservation. We're here to support CITES and the CITES regulation of the international trade in endangered species. And we're also here to support industry action on sustainable sourcing. In doing so, we're supporting a number of the Sustainable Development Goals. You can see there, you know, goal 1 all the way through 1, 2, 3, 5 on gender, 8, 10, 12, life on land down to partnerships in 17. So we see ourselves as integrated across the Sustainable Development Goals to deliver this. Okay, so yes, I am allowed to do one slide of plug for FairWild that isn't completely dispassionate. And that is that we believe that we are the most comprehensive and rigorous certification. We believe that we provide assurance at every level that this thing is being done properly. So yes, it's different to organic and other fair trade certifications, but it's complementary and it encompasses quite a lot, all of it. We're very much open to collaborating with other standards as we are already, and with other organizations. And for example, we recognized under Fair for Life, which is a sort of a fair trade kind of thing. We collaborate with the Wildlife Friendly and Enterprise Network. And essentially we have this growing network around the globe with all of these brands. So we're also trying to forge new business connections. And I think this is something Gus sort of alluded to indirectly as well. We really do need to try and put together the work we do on the ground with collectors, with processors, with traders, down to the big brands, to try to help the big brands to know that they can access sustainably harvested products, and that in turn they can provide products to consumers that have the FairWild label, that are guaranteed to do what they need to do. So we proactively try to help make those connections as well. And we attend industry events and things like that. Please get in touch to know more. That's all I have to say. Thank you. Don't have any problems.
Thank you, Deborah. We're doing pretty well for time, I think. The question I'll hold for later, but to think about is, how can a standard like FairWild help to grow the market in Africa? You mentioned right at the end the connection to the big brands. And what about the little brands? Well, think about it. Questions for clarification? Anybody have a question for clarification? Nope. So you can see why Gus is on the board of FairWild, and you can see Deborah's got a work cut out with Gus. So you can see the connection there. And that's actually, it's these two that made us want to do this event. Because I think Gus said it very well. I mean, wildlife isn't just about the four-legged creatures. And some four-legged creatures eat other four-legged creatures, but most of them eat plants. And the ones that I like to eat mostly are vegetarians. So I always say I eat my vegetables processed into a kudu or a wildebeest, but it's a vegetarian-based product. And so the role of plants, and also as Deborah was saying, that linking this together, linking the what do you call it? What we think about with wild animals, what we think about with wild plants, and then also what we think about with us as a community and how we live on that landscape is hugely important. And so we're really lucky in this event that we've got not you as a new one, but we even have a newer employee, Sobantu, who joins us from Resource Africa, started his job here in our event. This is his first day on his new job. So this is, you're old, Deborah. You've been on the job for a few weeks. I mean, you've now got you're on call. So Sobuntu's from South Africa. He's an active, I would say he's an equal justice warrior, but that maybe is a strong language, an activist in this area. He works a lot about rights. And so it's not just about conservation, but it's about people. Gus made an reference to it, that the knowledge is in people. People should have the rights to the knowledge, and so on and so forth. And so we're very fortunate to have him here to talk to us about the whole link between the wild plant economy and the communities that benefit and have the knowledge and so on. So I'm going to turn it over to you. You get your 15 minutes of fame, and I'm sure your boss is going to be happy with this as a first day on the job.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sobantu Mzwakali, and as it is, I understand. As it has already been mentioned, it's my first day at Resource Africa, but then I'll be alluding to work that I've done previously as coming from Natural Justice, which is Lawyers for Communities and Environment. And this is the work that we've been doing in the past, but also in collaboration with Resource Africa. So I be alluding to anything that I don't know, but then I'll be drawing from my work from natural justice, but then also the work that I'll be continuing with at Resource Africa. So I'll focus on the opportunities in the access and benefit sharing. So Gus mentioned that it's, in most cases, also a very frustrating aspect or component, mostly for people in the industry sometimes, because fairly based on not well developed policy or legal frameworks, and which we are still continuing and trying to transform or develop that further. But what is being envisioned in the ABS is that when these resources are being extracted from communities, firstly, because we've seen in some aspects of conservation is that when people are trying to build or try to establish a national park, they will drive communities outside, and then communities that have identities and then also relationship with those resources, then they don't have access to those national parks. And then therefore they can't continue with their maybe cultural practices, which are also connected to the resources. But then also when these resources are being extracted and being exploited for commercial use, communities should also derive benefits from that. And firstly, which is why it's also making it difficult in South Africa, is that you don't only engage with the harvesters or collectors, but with a history of land dispossession and colonialism, you realize that we also have people who have traditional or indigenous knowledge to those plants or resources. And then when you extract that, you extract their knowledge, but then they are no longer residing on that land where you're extracting the resource. So then now, if you want to enter into access and benefit sharing agreement with a community, you have to now engage the resource stewarding community, but then also traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge holding communities. And then that's where sometimes most people find it very frustrating. But I'll be drawing from the work that we've done with the natural justice supporting the communities, the Khoi and San communities, but then also as the Cedarburg region communities in the industry-wide benefit sharing agreement that was signed in 2019. So this was a precedent setting because this was at a national level. So we had benefit sharing agreements in the past, but we've never seen them at the national level. Also where you're trying to bring the harvesters or the collectors, but then as well as traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge holders. So then there'll be a levy that the rooibos industry will be paying to these communities, firstly for the traditional knowledge that they have, but then also but then also for stewarding the resource over the years. So I'll be focusing on this example. So, but then the people who will be benefiting from this are the Khoi and San communities, but then also 40. Some are also Khoi and San communities, but in communities in the Cedarburg region where we find rooibos in South Africa. So yeah, I'm just gonna tell you what has happened so far with that. So the ABS, it comes from when we talk about the CBD, which is a protocol in the Nagoya Protocol, which premise already from what I've mentioned or what I've alluded earlier on. But then also what is found in the BCP, and then this is where it's difficult in South Africa, what we are trying to do is we're trying to come up with a tool to assist communities so that they can organize and mobilize themselves so that they can enter into these negotiations or engagement with external stakeholders, that if the industry or any company has an interest into entering this, into engagements with the community, you find that it's difficult. Already I mentioned people being removed from the resource, whom have traditional knowledge, and then maybe they don't have connection with those who are residing. So then how do you organize these people? But then also with the history again, where traditional knowledge, but then also other traditional practices have been sidelined, how do you try to align that? So we try to take from the international legal framework, national framework, and then we also try to bring customary law. So then we try to come up with a way of building a local practice where communities can then try to determine to say, this is how we want to be approached for us to give consent to a particular company so that they can enter into benefit sharing with us. But then for us, the processes of arriving to that consent, these are the processes drawing from other principles like FPIC and things like that, but then also say in our own traditions or in our own customary law or in our own customary practices, we have ways of how then we provide FPIC, because you realize sometimes, particularly with FPIC, there are some loopholes in our South African legal framework in terms of how do you quantify a very consent, and then how do you say this is how we have reached consent in this community. So for communities, they will have to develop something that is called the BCP. So the BCP is coming from the protocols in the Nagoya Protocol, which are the biocultural community protocol. So in these biocultural community protocol, try to organize community who have connection to this resource, try to allow them to have inter and intra dialogues. And then from this dialogue, they develop this protocol where they say, these are the processes that are embedded in our customary practices. And then these are the procedures that you have to follow if you want to engage us on, or if you want us to grant you with a consent. But then also, more interestedly, these are also our priorities as communities, because when people engage communities, sometimes there are some paternalistic practices that they come up with. They say, no, we will build you school, but then maybe that's not an interest in the school. The community has already certain priorities. So whoever's trying to enter into a deal with them must also try to find a way in terms of engaging communities. Say, what are your priorities? But then also in some instances, we've seen also in South Africa, particularly in cases also of natural resources, where communities have a different interest when it comes to economy, or how we perceive economy from the existing paradigm. And then there's sometimes where there's a contradiction around that. And then communities must be able to say, we are only interested in keeping our resources. We don't want to further exploit them because of the connection they have with our identity, or the connection that they have with our history. So then therefore, we don't want to see them depleting. We don't want to see them depleting because they have a connection to us. So then therefore, we are not maybe interested in this economic paradigm. And then so we have to find a way with that. So you will also, in trying to, so these BCPs serves as an interface where I said we bring the international framework, drawing from Nagoya Protocol, the FPIC principles, and then coming down to South Africa in Section 211, also where the customary practices are also recognized by South African law. I mean, we have currently highly contested legal framework called the Traditional Khoisan Leadership Act, which has been coming for a while now, trying to recognize the traditional practices, but also the Khoi and San communities, of which post 1994 in South Africa were not also recognized. So, but it's doing that also with it has some limitations and things like that. But then you will see in South Africa that we recognize these customary practices. So once you've recognized these customary practices, you also have to abide with other existing national frameworks such as NEMA, and BABS regulations. But then they also talk about how can communities participate in managing their resources, but then also in any way of how, I mean, in any way that they can co-manage their resources, but in any way that they engage anyone if they want to exploit those resources. So these nexus or this interface of these legal frameworks from customary law, international framework and national framework, we develop this protocol from that. And then from this protocol, then we use it, so communities can use it to engage the industry, to say, if you come to our community, you're not, sometimes, even if you're not here to extract at the large scale, but then you're also coming to extract our knowledge as communities, then the communities say, what is our benefit? So then in some instances, there'll be monetary benefit, but in some instances, there'll be non-monetary benefit. We'll say, since maybe you're a research institute, then you will take one of few people in the communities and then maybe train them or be part of the process as well, so that they can also have a skill that they're receiving from this. So then the BCPs then will also will also give you guidance in such things, then to say, for researchers or for people who are to extract our knowledge, these are the processes, these are priorities. For those who want to exploit the resources, these are the priorities. And then this is our, these are the processes. With that theory in mind, then there's a practice that has already took precedence in South Africa, is the one that I've mentioned earlier on, of the industry-wide signed benefit sharing agreement, which was, yes, precedent setting in 2019. But then to get to that in 2019 is that there was a work that the National Khoisan Council was doing, which is the body that is organizing the Khoi people in South Africa, that they were trying to develop this BCP, because already there was an interest from the industry to engage with the communities, also before then, there was already a Nestle case that was international, and then it is already confirmed that the Khoi and San people of South Africa have traditional knowledge to rooibos. So already then they had to use the BCP to go and claim their right, because historically or over the years, industry was using this knowledge without acknowledging that it's from these communities. So then they developed this BCP in 2013. And then when this BCP was developed, then they organized these communities from different communities across the country, but then also included the Cedarburg communities, because this is where they were also strategically aware that the industry can engage harvesters or collectors in absence of traditional knowledge holders. So, but then if you are bringing two different groups who have two different interests, then how do you bring them together and try to develop something that's workable? So then this is where the BCP then assists them to come together. They can articulate their expression, they can articulate their procedures and processes, but then they can also articulate their priorities. And then they can then give a guideline to say, if anyone wants to engage us as a community, this is how you get, or this is how you get a consent from the National Cohesion Council. So this was how then this BCP then was used then to engage the Rooibos Council. And then from that BCP then, and then the engagement with the Rooibos Council is what culminated into the ABS agreement that was signed in 2019, where we will see a certain percentage from the profit made in the Rooibos Council that derived from that and then given to the Khoisan and Khoisan communities. So this is one of the monetary benefits that exist within the ABS framework. So, but then this is just, So this is just an example of how this works out. So the Rooibos industry or the Rooibos Council will pay the money into the Biodiversity Trust that sits with the Department of Environment, Forestries and Fisheries. And then from that, the two groups, because of their histories and also the differences that they have, the Khoi and then the San will also split based on their existing or their representative council. And then they take those resources, and then those resources will have to go to their trust. Then they will have to have the trust established. And then within this trust, then the resources go there. But then the beneficiaries of this trust or of this, of these benefits, then for example, this one is just an example of the Khoi group, will then be the Griqua, Nama people and stuff. Everyone else who's recognizing as that or who's also participating in that, then will have to come and claim these resources from there. But then this is also more technical because, more difficult because mostly it's monetary one. But then just an example around that. So this is also based on our BEPS regulation, because then these resources have to be, the resources have to be derived from the profits and then be put into our biodiversity trust, but then the biodiversity trust from government has to send them further to communities. So this is how, in that agreement that was signed in 2019, the Khoi and San people are going to derive their resources from the Rooibos profit. And this is just another example of that. But then outside of that, and I know Gus has already mentioned this, there's also other work that we've been doing in the Abiosa project, of which I think Gus already introduced in his presentation, which is also a German-funded, Swiss and German-funded project, where now we are trying to organize these communities. So there's an interest in Bochum Marula and Aluferox. But then, for example, if you look at the dispensation of Aluferox, of Marula in South Africa, then you will realize just from Northwest, Limpopo, and KZN, how do you organize all those communities to come together and sit down maybe with the industry and then enter into an agreement? It'll be very difficult to do that. So then we try to devise this tool called the Biocultural Community Protocols, where we allow all these communities to have this inter and intra engagement. And then from that, then they develop this BCP, and then they will say, these are the representatives that you will engage on our behalf. These are the processes. This is how we'll provide consent. And then this is how then we are also these are the priorities that we have as communities. So this one that we are currently doing with the with the Biosa project, it's focusing mainly on these 3 resources, which is Aluferox, Marula, and Buhu. And we're trying to come up with this way where communities now are not only now interested mainly in monetary benefit, but now in these BCPs that we are trying to develop with them, we're also trying to see other non-monetary value that can also be derived from these resources. For example, if the research institute is maybe focusing only on maybe research and development aspect of that, what kind of monetary what kind of non-monetary value can be derived of that? So those are things that we are still grappling with and trying to see how do we organize these communities and then how do they come to an agreement so that they can engage anyone else with that. So we are hoping to see something fruitful out of this, but then also we in this one, which is much more easier compared to the Rooibos one, is we are also trying to figure out in the value chain as well, where do you also put communities outside just being collectors or harvesters, but in the entire value chain also, where do we also put them? So this is also another aspect that we are engaging right now. So yeah, thank you very much.
Listening to you, it seems that there's a huge opportunity for lawyers in the wildlife economy. Oh my golly gosh, it's really tough stuff. But the legal, you're just talking about one country until the very end. You're just talking about SA. And every country on the continent has to figure out a legal framework to deal with these issues and get those protocols right. And as Gus had mentioned in his earlier talk, some places the customary usage is still not allowed. And here, at least in South Africa, it's allowed. And I'm talking to my friends in Ghana, they say, if you have a native tree on your property, it's owned by the state. You can't do anything with it. But if you have a coffee tree or a cocoa tree, you can do something with it. So they don't even have rights to customary usage there. So at least you've got that. But it does show the need for law, that's for sure. I have one question of clarification. So this act came in 2019, this agreement. Has any money been transferred yet?
There has been money that has been paid into the Biodiversity Trust. However, it has not went to the communities based on the politics of the country. The ministry trying to have like some sort of an event around this when they make that announcement. So it could be some sort of a political tracing thing. So yeah, but then there's already the Rooibos Council has already paid into the Biodiversity Trust that sits with the.
So it's made it to Pretoria, but it hasn't.
Yeah, it hasn't come.
Oh boy. Okay, good. Any other question of clarification? Anybody?
Morning, everyone. Maybe not a point of or a question, not a question, but rather I think I tend to relate. By the way, my name is Mzwakali. I am a stakeholder engagement officer that has got 3 projects, 2 wood harvesting projects based in 2 of the 3 reserves I work in. And then there's sour fig harvesting that is giving me sleepless nights. But anyways, there is a great need for I think the 2 speakers that came through, I think I was hoping to engage them on the side, but currently we have a situation that's inverse. It's not Cape Nature going into the communities, it's rather the communities working with us. And because I started, I don't know if I still can call myself a newbie because it's been a year and a half. I started during lockdown with so many restrictions in 2020. I have over the months learned, because sour figs specifically are like a 3-month season, starting 3 to 5, starting October to March just now. And with our permit conditions, we allow community members to harvest within the reserves, and there's a permitting system in place. But with that, I have realized that what is on the permits, in coming back to the interests of the people and what Cape Nature has been implementing, those things are not, or what has been on the permit rather, is not really what's happening on the ground. And luckily we're a flexible organization. We are able to adjust and amend while engaging those community members. So in short, there's a great need looking at it from another way, not rather communities in protected areas and not in their communities or in their areas. But there's you do get a bit of a tug of war or tension going on there, but in terms of benefit sharing and all those things, I'll speak to the presenters on the side. But great work, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. Well, we've got one more talk and the speaker doesn't need any introduction at all because you've been listening to me for much of the morning. And also, Gus, this is the way to get more than 15 minutes. Chair your own talk, and then you can add in a couple more minutes. No, you guys can figure out your timing, so I have to shut up. The plant economy, we've talked a lot about goods here. We've seen a lot of different products being produced. And I thought it might be useful to also talk about plant services. There was a little reference to that on the carbon sequestration value of it. And this talk will be, and it's not that long of a talk, but there's a big opportunity on this continent to get into carbon sequestration, carbon storage, and using the plants on this continent to actually make money for communities by conserving and restoring forests, including coastal forests. And so this focuses on marine carbon opportunities. And this, you'll see, I'm going to show some examples around the continent. The mangroves don't quite make it down here to the strand, but they do come into South Africa. So mangroves are South Africa all the way around the Indian Ocean and up the other side too. So it's a big landscape on the continent where plants can provide a service, an ecosystem service of carbon storage. So I've got just a few slides. I'm going to give you two projects that have existed, one in Senegal and one in Kenya. Then I'm going to talk about some of the work I did earlier on investing in mangroves with IUCN. Then talk about the potential from some analysis we've done in Mozambique and Tanzania, and then also some potential in Nigeria and even here in South Africa. And then present a program that is also a FAIR program. It's FAIR Carbon, not FairWild, that's trying to develop guidance for that. And then a program, one example of a big NGO program in this space, and then where the African Union's going in with this. So it's a big topic, and it could be quite a big market for the wild plant economy, if you will. Back about 10 years ago or so, Livelihoods Fund, and what's now the Livelihoods Fund, set up a large mangrove restoration project in Senegal. It was actually started as a partnership between Danone, the French yogurt company. Danone also owns Evian, a very upmarket water brand that's produced by mining water off the shores of Lake Geneva. And they wanted to sort of green up the Evian label. And they thought a nice way to green up Evian water would be to do a wet carbon project, a wetland carbon project. So they went for mangroves. And the first one was this. Danone worked with IUCN and with the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. And then out of that, they then spun off the Livelihoods Fund. So this was a huge project. About 8,000 hectares were restored. As they say, they got about 500,000 tons of carbon. 79 million trees were planted. I'm not a scientist either, but they were the red ones, not the black ones, because the red ones you can stick in the soil. And so they planted reds, hoping the blacks would come in. They did that in two estuaries, Casamance to the south of the Gambia and Saloum to the north of the Gambia. So it's a huge program with hundreds of villages involved and so on. Also, to get it done, part of the structure of this, Deborah talked about certification and standards. There wasn't a standard for mangrove carbon. So we also, through IUCN and with IUCN partners, developed a mangrove carbon methodology that then went to the UNFCCC, to the Clean Development Mechanism. When it was approved as an official standard, it's still used. Didn't capture all the carbon. The standard took a forest standard and looked at above surface carbon and didn't get into the root structure in the soils, but at least you got that credit out of there. And so that was the first big project, and that's a real project, very big. And if you look on, they're quite an activist commercial organization. So if you look on their website, you see some nice videos and so on. It was quite good. And there you've got a picture in the background of the people planting the mangroves. Another one, much smaller, but is sort of a postal child of this whole topic, is the Makoko Pamoja project on the south coast of Kenya. And this was set up a few years ago by, actually came out of the brainchild of a professor at the University of Edinburgh, who was down there running essentially an ecotourism research project with Earthwatch Institute. And it had all these volunteer scientists going and studying the mangroves in this little village down in Gazi Bay. And then he got done with it and said, well, we've got all these mangroves that we've sort of identified and we categorized, and we've looked at their threats and we see where we can restore some. Why don't I go to my buddies down the street in Edinburgh, Plant Vivo, and see if we can get a carbon credit out of them. So he did, and he set up a little British charity called ACES, worked with the communities, and they've set up this small scale project. It's one village, about 500 people. They've done about 14,000 Plant Vivo certificates, which is one of the certification standards. The big one is VERA, VERA, but this was one of the ones, and they did it through getting credit for both protecting mangroves under threat, and you'll see that language used a bit more, and restoring mangroves, planting new ones. So a bit of credit for protection and a bit for restoration. They even won an award from UNDP a couple years later of $20,000 because they were such a sexy little project. But then you get in, that's why I asked where the money went. I'm curious. When the award was granted, then all of a sudden the Department of Forestry, the government said, well, wait a second, the mangroves actually belong to us, not to the community. So we get the award, not the community. And property rights issues on coasts, property right issues, ownership rights, use rights, and so on are very, very complicated, as you can imagine. So a few years ago, working with IUCN and with WWF Germany, we put together a investment guide of which Makoko Pomojo was one of the case studies. Another one was in Madagascar, and the third one was in Vietnam, where we looked at how we can provide an incentive for more cash to flow into these areas with carbon credits as a main driver, but also looking at fisheries and tourism. And one of the reasons for that is said in the clip in the middle, is that mangroves are 3 to 5 times higher than that of a tropical upland forest. There's a lot of carbon on the coast. There's stacks of carbon on the coast. So there's actually a lot of bang for the buck to invest in a reforestation program like this. And so there's, plus all the benefits that mangroves do with protecting the coastline from tsunamis and so on and so forth. And so here in the very small one on the right, and I kept it small intentionally because now you get into the details. In 15 minutes, we don't have to do that. How do you set up this thing? What type of structure you have? But part of it is how do you structure it? Who pays for it? Who certifies it? What type of carbon are you dealing with? So there's what's called the RED Plus, reduced emissions from deforestation and land degradation or whatever. And that's to be paid not to cut it down, if you will, to protect it. And then there's this reforestation, planting new mangroves and getting new carbon storage, carbon sequestration. So all that's involved in this. And that little manuals, it's okay. What you can do is look at that and say, okay, that's a start. But it was a start to get the conversation going. Then a couple of years ago, also working with IUCN, we and scientists in Sweden tried to assess the carbon stocks along the coasts of Mozambique and Tanzania. And I mean, if you just go up past KwaZulu and Nepal and you look at those two coasts, they're massive, absolutely massive, and stacks of mangroves, stacks of carbon. And part of the discussion of that research was how much of that carbon, what do you call it, is there vis-a-vis what's terrestrial? And actually, we've spent a lot of time thinking of terrestrial carbon, but coastal carbon's huge. And this mangroves, you've got the seagrasses, et cetera. And so that part of the case of the study was to say it's material, there's material out there. A second part was, well, there are protected area systems. Our marine protected area systems actually conserve carbon, but they focus more on biodiversity than carbon, but there you go. And thirdly, what came out of that is that there was a huge potential in those two countries to get into the carbon credit business, either for getting paid to protect the carbon stocks that exist or being paid to restore carbon stocks that have been degraded. So, but again, it's property rights, it's law, it's access, community empowerment that are some of the blockages, and what do you call it, policy blindness. Then we've been in discussion in AWEI with a little group called the Niger Delta Mangrove Restoration Project. The Niger Delta is your big daddy of mangroves on the continent. It's also a big daddy of petroleum on the continent, and they on top of each other. And so there's loads of challenges, loads of opportunities, but there's obvious customers for carbon credits. All the oil companies, Shell, Total, Chevron, that extract billions of dollars of value, and with all the challenges of degradation and the 30 million people that live in the Delta and so on. So they're a little group, and then getting ready for the slide deck, I just went on what's going on out there, and I said, oh my gosh, there's a new crowd called Blue Carbon Project Nigeria. Yes, looking at the mangrove forest. I don't know who they are, but there's people out there. So people are now looking at carbon Indian Ocean side, Atlantic side, and so on. And here down south, there's a potential. So the one that interests me, and I've had some discussions with Wild Act about this, is the little bits of mangroves left in Durban. And according to the bit of history that I've got here, this country has about 2,000 hectares of mangroves. I don't know how far south they go. Does anybody know? But they make it at least to Durban. I don't know if they make it to East London. They certainly don't make it to the Strand. I don't think they've made it down here. And they won't survive in Bloberg, will they? So, but they're up there. They're up on the KZN area. And this says the history was, and this is an interesting bit, is when the port of Durban was built, they took out about 440 hectares of mangroves, and all that's left is this little beach road mangrove nature reserve. Now, I haven't been there, but you can walk through, and I was looking at the websites on it, and this is a picture, aerial photo of the area. It looks really quite nice, but it's 13 hectares that's left. And it's in a big industrial harbor. Could that be protected, restored? Could somebody develop a carbon credit that could help finance this reserve and maintain the reserve? And if you could do it in Durban, could you go up north and do it? So this opportunity is around the continent as a ecosystem service out of wild plants. We're also working with a group called Fair Carbon, not FairWild, but Fair Carbon. We have to work on the branding here with these two organizations. Very small startup group that's connected with some folks up in Switzerland that are very, very interested in ocean conservation, interested in plastics and so on. Maybe the Swiss, like Zimbabwe, they're landlocked. They wish they had the sea, so they spend a lot of time on this. But what they've got an idea, and I've been quite actively involved with them, is part of the problem is helping these communities around see this opportunity and figure out how to go through the steps. To be able to develop what they call a PIN, a project information, and then a project design document, and get all the pieces together, the law, the planting program, and get the third-party certification. By the time you get that done, it's very, very complicated. And so what we're trying to do is to figure out a way to provide practical guidance to scale up this around the continent and to move towards a more opportunities for carbon sequestration through coastal restoration projects, particularly on mangroves, but also looking at seagrasses, starting with mangroves. And then last two slides, there's a program that Wetlands has, which makes sense, Wetlands International, on mangrove capital Africa, where they've been looking at, again, this is their language, how to focus on mangrove forests because they're major carbon stores, 5 times more carbon than inland forests, they say. And they also mention here, which the other projects also like to do, the fish productivity, the socioeconomic activities, and so on. So there's a program that's going for a while, but it doesn't quite feature in credits yet. So the interesting thing is to go back then to somebody like Wetlands and say, great, you've identified mangrove areas that we can conserve. Can we also get some economic value out of them, which will actually drive the conservation, support livelihoods, and so on? Can we look at the economy potential around a mangrove conservation project? And then finally, this actually fits into the African Union strategy on the blue economy, which says here, blue carbon is a part of the blue economy. This is the AU report. And the current value is estimated to the average monetary value of $130,000 per square kilometer of mangroves, soft marshes, or seagrasses. And they think that this could go from 40 billion to 45 billion to a $70 billion business here in Africa by 2063. So another piece of this puzzle from an AWEI perspective is talking about the communities and helping them do that, but also looking at the enabling environment and to see what extent the African Union's blue economy strategy can be rolled out and support these projects and help with the governance, help with the legal framework, and so on. So there you go. That's another opportunity in the wild plant economy. Done. How's that? No questions. Huh? Did I make my time? I should have been just fine, huh? Questions for clarification?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jean-Pierre Duplessis. Thanks so much for the informative carbon credit chat. I was just wondering, I checked into Fair Carbon and all of these, and I mean, as a company, African Data Technologies, we've been looking into the carbon market. The big thing, unfortunately, is it's very expensive to even just access them. So 13 hectares, for instance, in Durban would be a very difficult one to get going in terms of current standards. Do you see any progression there where there are smaller standards or where the verification or auditing standards are maybe lowered a bit in order to increase scale? And secondly, are there other innovative funding methods that could reach the same goal apart from carbon credits, that you've become aware of? Thanks.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. The standards are very complicated. Deborah mentioned that with FairWild that they have a very big and complicated standard that they're going to try and improve. All the standards have gone for sort of like the gold standard of standards, and they're very big and complicated, which is why access to this is quite difficult. But they're all revising and revising. So Vera, which is the big one, and this used to be called the Voluntary Carbon Standard, then Verified Carbon Standard. Now it says Vera, is a trendier name, VERRA. They're also going through revision. And so part of that revision is to try and make this stuff more accessible. There's another piece too, is that the carbon, if you're driving this from carbon, people look in and they say, well, we want that credit because we need it on the other side. So there's a debate, of course, on the other side. Should we be offsetting all this carbon, or should people just quit polluting and quit putting the stuff out? Some industries can change and decarbonize easier than others. So the airline industry, it's a bit tougher. So you might rationalize, let's do credits for them. Look at the airline industry. You need a lot more than those few acres in the harbor of Durban. You know, it's large scale stuff. So there's that. But then there's other people that may be saying, no, we want to conserve, say, this reserve in Durban, of which we can now acknowledge carbon as a piece of what it's delivering. So that the financing is about the biodiversity, maybe it's about the community engagement, and it's also has carbon in it. And in that sense, I think you're right that there's an opportunity to recognize carbon, even if it isn't technically certified, that somebody could go and do a carbon audit and say, we recognize the carbon's there, and that's a piece of what this program is delivering, because the very technical carbon stuff, it's complicated, and so you need bigger scale. That's definitely true. Yes, Deborah.
The first is Lizanne and Francis have asked if you could possibly provide a bit of info and practical guidance relating to inland carbon sequestration projects. Is there anything you could put across in relation to that?
Sure. Should I start with that?
I think so, and then I'll give you the others afterwards.
Yeah, it's the technical stuff, and just responding to the last question, it's the technical carbon market. It's been most for nature-based carbon is mostly focused on terrestrial. So these standards, like even the standard that we developed for mangrove carbon for the UNFCCC, do I have enough C's in there? That was based on the one that was developed for terrestrial forests. So there's a big opportunity there. The big debate and discussion is do you go after getting a credit by sequestering, adding new carbon in, that's reforestation, revegetation, and get that? Or do you also trying to get it by saying we want to be paid for the carbon that's already there? Some of the discussions going on the continent, and I've seen this with national parks, for example, saying, oh, we've got a lot of carbon, saying Masai Mara, we should get paid for it. Well, that carbon should actually be protected by the protected status of the Masai Mara. So you've got some debates of how you'd structure, but the planting is trees. Yeah, same thing, same model.
Do you have any indication of where people could go for some practical information and guidance?
well, technically to the faircarbon.org website, but it's under development. But yeah, you can go there. I would also look at the Plan Vivo website. Plan Vivo's more of a sort of NGO-ish carbon standard, and Vera's more commercial. But Plan Vivo's got a nice little guide on the website that you can look at, and you can look through it, because the very first thing you need to do is just sort of sit in front of a computer and say, like that, 17 hectares, this is what I have to do. Maybe I think twice. Oh, 200 hectares, this is what, oh yeah, we got to go here. So you got to do a desk think first. I'd go with the Plan Vivo site to start with, website.
Another question from Alexander McPherson is, he'd like to hear more about, and this is the same old really, the very obviously a commonly interesting question, is how are the carbon credits distributed to communities, the projects, government, or whatever, the whole distributional issue again. Can you address that?
Okay, so one of the challenges is with this, and this is very true in coastal carbon, is getting clarity on who has the rights to their resource, who has the use rights. Most of your coastlines are owned by the government. And so the communities may have had traditional use rights, but do they really have rights and use rights? So in the case of the Makoko Pamoja one in Kenya, they had to go and negotiate with the government that the community, if they took on this work, would actually have the rights to it. So you had to get the legal right done. I know in the case that Blue Ventures did in Madagascar, the very first people they hired, lawyers. They hired lawyers before they hired anybody else to deal with that. And what do you call it? Then the communities have to set up a structure that disperses those funds. And it's like a campfire for carbon. You've got to have an institutional structure. They've got to, say what they're going to do with the funds and so on and so forth. And the Kenyan case study has that. The community's organized. They have a bank account. They get about $6,000 a year out of their carbon, I guess. Yeah.
Finally, Alexandra Zafindamaro from Madagascar is asking, can you just give a few words of more background on the Madagascar case study?
It's in that investment book. It's on the north of the coast. And what Blue Ventures had done, they're very active there, is they've gone into a couple communities on the north coast of Madagascar and said, how can we create community-based enterprise, community-based conservation? And they actually took a more holistic approach. So carbon was a piece of the puzzle. They looked at fisheries, they looked at tourism, they looked at carbon. And then the first part of it, as I just alluded to, was to get clarity on what rights the community could have over those resources. So then you have to go back to capital, you got to get the legal rights and so on. And once you've got the legal rights sorted out, then you could start to develop the community-based enterprises. Now that legal rights story is often a big barrier. They can't even get going there in a place like Madagascar. But it would be, that report came out a couple of years ago, and it'd be very interesting to ask the question I sort of asked now, what happened now? What's happened there? But the plan was to get a carbon credit plus sustainable fisheries around the mangroves plus the tourism industry going. How's that sound? Oh boy, you guys made me work. Okay, then I don't have to do much in the next part, which is our open discussion. So just stretch for a second here. This because we got a few more minutes here, and then we can open up and discuss. What we have to do is, because we're live, hello everybody online, and our panelists are sitting at a table, is when you've got questions for the panelists, you guys are going to have to get up here and get in front of the screen so our folks around the continent can also see you. So I'll step aside and you step up, and you can stand up here if you want. And so this is a sort of open questions to our panelists, and when we get near to the end, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give a 1 minute sort of wrap up, and then we'll go for about another half hour. So first question. So be ready to jump up if you have to, guys and gals.
Hi, everybody. My name is Molly. I'm a researcher. I'm actually a master's student from the University of Cologne in Germany. I'm doing my research on indigenous edible plants, actually. So I got a question for our first speaker. My research question is on how, what's the potential to commercialize the indigenous edibles? So that's including what we mentioned before, kaipo, nam nam, sour figs. And my research question also include what are the challenges or the barriers to commercialize this. So my question would be, what's your experience, or like, how do you deal with the barriers to commercialize those indigenous plants? Because you mentioned the policy bluntness and the not ready market, and that's exactly what I found during my research. So I wonder if you have any comments. Thank you.
You also can take them, but take it here and then we can stretch it.
Cool.
We'll go for another 25 minutes and then we can break.
Great question there on the barriers to commercializing. So 2018, 2019, there was a PhD thesis out of University of Johannesburg that identified 1,760 edible plant species in Africa or Southern Africa, I don't remember. Almost none of which had been successfully commercialized. And obviously that's a huge opportunity. So there's all these plants that have been traditionally consumed. We've got 80% of the world's nutrients come from basically 3 plants, and you got all the rest of these plants that are not being looked at. So the biggest obstacle is regulatory hurdles, and there are countries all over the world that have rules and regulations that are designed to protect their domestic industry and make it hard. So the European Union has the EU novel foods, the US has the FTA regulations, etc., etc. Baobab, we took it through the EU novel foods. It took us 4 years. It cost us $500,000 US, and a lot of my time and a lot of other people's time, but we got there. Baobab is still not approved in China because the Chinese regulatory approval process is another $200,000 US, and no one has had the money to be able to do it. So it's illegal to supply Baobab to China, which is biggest potential market for it. So there are many, many, many challenges, but so that's the bad news. But the good news is you can do it. You just have to say, right, I'm going to do it. We are going to do it. And it just requires systematic, concerted effort. As a result of work that Phytotrade Africa, the trade association, which put Baobab through the EU novel foods approval process, as a result of their work, the European Union made a simpler process for traditional foods. So it is now much easier than it was back when we did it to get a traditional food approved for sale. But it's a headache, and you won't do it in an arbitrary and random manner. You've got to sit down and say, right, I am going to do this. It's underway at the moment for, I know, several species from Southern Africa that are currently going through the process. Lipia javanica, Zumbani, as we call it, the herbal tea. Barbara nut is one that's just going through. Marula fruit are just going through the EU approval process. I'm sure there are others as well. So it is possible, but that's why I said that a sector support organization, because the problem is if you're a business, if you are one company producing this product and you incur all the expenses, all your competitors are then going to benefit from that. And it's hard. No, not many companies are prepared to do that. But having a sector organization which represents all the industry, that's the excellent way to do it, because then you're doing it on everyone's behalf and preferably using public sector money.
Please don't go away. Tasneem Variawa is asking, are there any considerations around the development of a horticultural sector for indigenous African plants, not just wild harvested? And what is the scope for such in the wildlife economy? Frank, you may want to pick up that a little bit. And under ABS, Sobantu may want to pick up that a little bit.
So I think my take home on that is yes, absolutely. But there's the English expression about the cart before the horse, and I've never really understood it. But essentially what we mean is that until there is a guaranteed market for these products, there's probably no point in investing in the horticultural production. An example from right here that some of you know, which I was talking about earlier on, was with Hoodia. Some of you will probably remember the whole Hoodia Godoni story a few years ago, and there were substantial investments made in producing and growing Hoodia. before the market had really been secured, and then the market collapsed and it was all a waste of time. So my approach is develop the market first. So lower all the barriers that will allow these new products to go into the market. Once you've done that, then, and the market is developing and growing, then sure, you can invest on the horticultural production side. But if you do that first, you may find you wasted your time.
Yeah, just to quickly add to that, one of the interesting, I think, windows of opportunity with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is that it's focused on removing technical barriers to trade. And if we can get a dialogue going on what are barriers to trade between countries, that bounces back to what are barriers to trade inside of countries as well. And so looking at these technical barriers that are stopping the growth of this sector, and we're talking about here, wild plants, can be done in a continental way and bounce back. So there's actually a TBT website that's been set up under the African mechanism where people can submit, and this can go to international discussion and so on. And I think we need to get active in it. I think it's a really good window for us to use. So we in the wildlife economy want to use the African Continental Free Trade Act as a vehicle to move the economy forward, animals as well as plants.
There are quite a few questions.
Okay, last question from online then, because and then we'll go on. Lanzerac raises a very interesting point that the South African model for the wildlife economy is based on sustainable use and giving value to wildlife, but ownership is a key component to this model. And in many cases, plants that have economic value are in areas that those that need to harvest or want to harvest are not the owners. And then you land up with the situation of illegal harvesting. So the result is that many of these plants are being threatened. And how do we how do we move past this? So she says they have a project SOS where they work at trying to connect kind of phytum and other plants in the Namaqualand being over-harvested for the horticultural trade. But communities are poor, and this is seen as a possible solution to generate an income. So how do we shift from a regulatory approach to an incentive-based approach? And I'm going to ask Sobantu, if I may, Frank, to give us a go at that.
Thank you very much for that question.
Want to use this one?
Oh, okay.
You don't need two. One will do.
I think actually what we're trying to do with the biocultural community protocol is actually trying to do that first. To say what are the priorities in these communities? Because if there is the ongoing economy paradigm that doesn't cater to them, what is immediate to them, and then how can they, I don't want to use the word, but exploit those resources. But then as already the person who posed the question already has an answer in that is the biggest issue of South Africa is our history of land dispossession. And then therefore, then you realize that, and this is the argument we've been making over the years, that for communities to fully participate in the conservation processes is to also try to understand that the question of conservation in South Africa is highly connected to the question of land. And then therefore, when we think about the alternatives or anything else, I'd like to argue that mostly we have to think of them in three levels. That yes, we might need a theoretical alternative to say, theoretically, how do we cater to a local market if there's no international market, and how do communities participate in that? And I think everyone, I'm not an academic, but then everyone in academia trying to come up with alternatives with that. And I agree with everyone else. But then we still need some sort of an organizational alternative as well. So then how do we locally organize our economies? And then also what are the forms of participation in that? And what do we also need to support that? And then that's when the question of land reform, or even if people are not owning land, but then access, the question of ABS, because I think the problem with ABS in South Africa has mainly focused on the benefits, monetary benefits that arise with that. But if then communities can have at least access to that land that has been used, then therefore that's another form of a benefit that they can derive of that. And then there's a use of that. And then therefore there's a market already in those communities, even if it's not maybe internationally recognized or nationally recognized by anyone else, but then there are markets there in those communities. In Western Cape, here we also have, for example, the Khoisan farmer, Khoisan healers as well. The healers that are also selling these resources, but in each and every day outside the CBD, they are always getting arrested for holding these resources and stuff. But that shows that there's a need locally. But then our focus is also our economic paradigm is focusing on international frameworks. But then the other third thing that I also think we have to think about, and this is mainly coming from a very left perspective, if you are not a leftist, it's that from the theoretical framework, we also need these organizational form, organize our own local markets or economies locally. But then thirdly, we also need an alternatives in terms of the state power that we have. In the last 20 years or anything else, in any aspect of governance, whether it's land reform or whether it's wildlife economy, there has been a hesitation of enforcing political will, particularly with issues related to regulated framework. That in South Africa, we have a tons of policy wonks that we all go there, develop policy and do all of these things. But if someone comes from outside, say, I'm interested in this resource, DEF doesn't respond. If everyone comes and say, we want to export this resource, we want to engage the communities and stuff, there's no response from government. So we also now have to start thinking around that to say, our current state or our current government, the way it's formed, there are also systematic hurdles that are inherent in terms of how the government from ministry to, if just the discussion from ministry, Sand Park, and maybe national parks in South Africa, it's a huge problem, and then there's no one who knows what role sometimes they have to play. Everyone else want to control maybe a certain part of resources or part of legislative framework. So that's what I'm saying. There's also that form that we also have to address when we think about alternatives from theoretic, but then also organizational form, but then also the power form. If then there's a power in South Africa that is embedded on people who have to implement the law, and then they're not doing that. So maybe I think we have to also think around that in absence of political will, what do we do with these beautiful laws that we have? Yeah, thank you.
Great questions from the cloud. Now we've got to have some questions from the floor, I think, from in-house. Who's got a hand up back there? Should we take way in the, do you want to go way in the back? There we go. Just say who you are too.
Master Blanche. I used to be a farmer. Seeing that most of the plants used, as Gus said, for the ingredients for medicines and things like that, I think there's a big possible chance that we'll see the extinction of many plants, and they're not being replaced. And I feel very strongly that we should see more research in the development, or the horticultural development of plants that are possibly endangered. I know that you are focusing mostly on establishing your markets and going through all the red tape of doing that. But in the meantime, we might be losing some very valuable plants. So I was wondering what, you have some iconic species like the baobab and the and bucho and so on. I know that there has been some research done in the past, but what are your views, Gus, on what we should do in terms of research and empowering the people to plant back the plants that they harvested so they don't go extinct?
Thanks. I'm trying to hand that one over to Tony Cunningham, who has done a lot of work on this, but he's giving me the evil eye. I think it's essential that we do that research. There's a kind of a paradox here in that I'm always preaching that adding commercial value to indigenous plants creates meaningful incentives for rural communities to invest in their sustainable management. And of course, ownership is a big part of that. And if they don't have ownership of it, that's going to be a different story. And one thing on the ownership that I would say that makes it a lot easier with plants as opposed to wildlife is that plants are static, whereas wildlife is a fugitive resource. So it can be quite hard to argue who owns a wild animal, but it's very easy to argue who owns a plant. But you are absolutely right, and history is littered with examples of plants that have been commercialized to death, quite literally. But I think, I don't think that's a reason to stop doing it. I think we just have to embrace it and recognize that it's a problem and that it needs to be dealt with. And that is exactly why the FairWild standard exists. It's so that you as a consumer can tell whether a product is genuinely being sustainably harvested or not. Because that's the problem we all have. We all consumers. And we are all potentially part of the problem, and we are all potentially part of the solution. But if we don't know, how do we know? How do we know if we're part of the solution or part of the problem? And that's what FairWild was set up precisely to achieve. So that was a long-winded answer, but I think it is very important that on a case-by-case basis, we look at the sustainability and we look at the production. Bear in mind that many medicinal plants growing into the pharmaceutical industry end up, no matter where their wild origins may be, they end up being standardized and industrially produced for standardization of the phytochemicals.
I'm from Sanby. I'm working on the National Sensitive Species List, which is assessing the plant sensitivity to overexploitation from poaching and medicinal use. Poaching in South Africa is a huge issue right now. I don't know if people are aware, but since 2019, there's been hundreds of thousands of plants removed illegally for ornamental succulent trade overseas. And I'm wondering how do you make plants more valuable in the ground as they are than people removing it for livelihoods, basically. I mean, the problem is there's a huge trade, a huge market for wild collected plants. So even if you want to cultivate them in nurseries, people still want these really special plants that only grow in this one section of this mountain, and plants are going extinct. So I'm surprised we haven't spoken about horticultural trade more in this wildlife economy. I mean, we have so much wild potential for the horticultural trade as well.
Mm.
I'm very sorry that I keep referring to the BCPs. So other link that BCPs have is also trying to look into the cultural connections that these species have to communities beyond the monetary benefit that might arise of that. And then if you build it and then you realize that there's a connection to culture or to also their identity, and then you also learn whilst you do these BCP processes, there are things that will come that are not part of our knowledge right now, that come out of the practices in communities that we as outsiders will see as myths or anything that we might consider delusionary. But then you realize that those practices that are embedded in those communities from people who are harvesting or who are collecting these resources, they have a way of harvesting these resources that conservation, but also is maintained in that regard, that you will hear stories that you don't throw a stone to maybe a marula tree because then you're gonna cause maybe floods or something like that. From an outsider, you might dismiss that as something that's very mythical or anything that regard. But in their practices, especially those that are done by healers and the likes, that how you cut a tree, how you cut a plant in that community and everything, there are stories behind that someone might dismiss, but then when you look deeper or closer to them, then you realize that there's a connection here of protecting biodiversity or trying to implement conservation. So in these BCPs, this is one of the things that we're trying to bring. And then the people in those communities where the resource, if it's being sold locally, they have a connection even with that. And then they can also hold one another accountable in that regard, that not everyone can come and maybe cultivate a particular species, because in that cultural practice, maybe it's only maybe women or something, but outside we might see it in a certain way that maybe this is mythical or maybe this is flawed and everything else. But in the BCPs, those are things that we are also trying to get out. I don't know if I understood the question really. Yeah.
So I'm not, I know poaching has like quite a heavy weighting these days. I'm more talking about like people removing plants from the wild to fuel illegal trade overseas. Like there's a huge Japanese American market for these like very specialized succulents in the country. So it's not at all about like, you know, the traditional side of it. It's actually just like people needing a livelihood and seeing that there's a market overseas for it and then removing the plant and sending it overseas. Yeah.
Sorry, I totally misunderstood your question.
I can't give you a very specific answer to this, but I think this is the big challenge that we're working on in what a wildlife economy is and how it is a complex system that brings together the rights and responsibilities and the very important word that Sobantu just used, which is accountability, how we are all accountable to each other, to the land, to the community, to the commercial world, and to the climate, in fact. And so we have to look to find these very complex solutions whereby it is also like Sobantu says, sometimes the community actually have a knowledge and an interest in conservation. So it's about getting those trade-offs between rights and responsibilities, between ownership and use, and respect and accountability all together, so that there isn't a simple response where somebody comes and takes a plant and sells it off because there's a market in China or Russia or whatever. It is that the system works together to ensure that there are conservation outcomes, sustainable livelihoods, and social well-being and understanding of those interconnected rights and responsibilities. I'm sorry, there's no specific easy answer to any of this. And one of the reasons we're here today is to try to understand how we can maximize the use of the resources in wildlife economies in such a way that we can generate enough for everybody and satisfy those complex demands.
We're almost out of time. If we could go on and on with this question, but we'll have one more question. Just a quick comment, and then we move to your 1 second though first. You said these plants are being poached, which implies that the harvester doesn't have ownership rights. So that might be something to ask. Why doesn't the harvester have ownership rights? So there are people that have a product they'd like to sell, they have customers, but somehow they're excluded from that source. And can we rethink that? So why do we call them a poacher and not a harvester? Because they've been excluded from the land where the product is. Something to think about. Yeah, last question, and then we're going to go eat some plants and some animals, hopefully too.
Great stuff, thank you. My name is Graham Lewis. I'm also from Cape Nature, like my colleague there. And a question that I was just thinking about, as I actually drove here, I saw a lot of these big fast food companies, you know, KFCs and all of those. And I'm pondering about that and thinking who's their biggest customer base. Is obviously the youth, you know. So that raises a question in my mind, you know, how do we educate? How do we use education and awareness actually to bring the wildlife economy to the youth? Because eventually they're going to be the customers that's going to actually buy these wildlife products and eventually protect the country and conserve and all of those things. So it's essential for that aspect to actually come into our education system, because eventually we, you know, that's going to be the resource that's going to conserve, that's going to use, and all of those things. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind. The future is in our youth's hands. Thank you.
Okay, very good point. Thank you. And it's a nice point for a university to hear. Thank you. And we accept any type of support that keeps working with youth. Behind your KFC, just the last word on the animal side, I'm staying in Durbanville where my mother-in-law lives and coming across the Stellenbosch, and I pass hundreds of these long buildings filled with chickens that never see sunlight, that lived about 28 days, chop goes the head, off they go to Nando's and KFC. And you sit there and you say, well, this is Africa, you shouldn't have that. You know, you should have things out in the wild and free range chickens and plants and so on. Maybe we can do some field trips on that and start to show people the value chains and how can we make these value chains more responsible and deal with land rights and engage with communities and so on. And I do think that's important. And that's where here at the African Wildlife Economy Institute, what we're saying is that this topic, you said complex system, but this topic is a topic that links law to philosophy, to sociology, to finance, to gender studies. And yes, back to zoology and back to botany and back to the natural sciences, but it's the interconnectivity of the way in which we understand and work with our living resources that's really important. And to me, the upside, and I know I'm going to end this with this, is what Gus said right at the beginning. The reason why it's so cool is that word Africa is this continent is the continent of biodiversity resource for the planet. If we can get the plant economy right, if we can get the animal economy right, everybody else can sit back and watch their Netflix and we'll just supply them with product because this is where it can come from. This continent's got incredible diversity of species and incredible potential, but we've got to connect those dots right. And it's a complicated thing. And we have to do that, not just by doing technical discussions with this, but embedding that sustainably in our youth by training the next generation and the next generation to do this. So I've gone over 1 minute and I'm going to stop. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I think it was a really interesting dialogue. I hope you enjoyed it. And for those online, thank you very much for staying in. 2 hours is a long time to be online. It's really, really tough, but it's fabulous you were able to join us. And I'm sorry you aren't here live to have a lunch, but the folks here in Stellenbosch are going to take a break now and have a little stand-up lunch. And so we're finished for the event. Thanks, everybody.